Are you tired of drilling holes in the bottom of worm bins? Well, if you are, this is the video for you. Why you don't need a drainage hole in your worm bins. Stay tuned to find out. Thanks so much for tuning in to Worm Watts, where we harness the God-given power of compost worms to transform seeming organic waste into amazing and living fertilizer. So, without further ado, let's hop into the question that we're trying to answer, which is, do we actually need drainage holes in our worm bin? The answer that I will provide you is a resounding no. You do not need holes in the bottom of your worm bin. And so before we go into the why of that, I'd love to maybe address some of the things that you might be going through if you're watching this video, right? So if you began your worm journey like me, you might be wondering all kinds of things about your worm bin, right? How much to feed it, what to feed it, when to feed it, how much to water it, what to use as your bedding. And you've got all of these questions, right? But for me, one of the questions that I also had was what kind of bin I was going to use. And so I saw some people utilized totes. I saw other people utilized stacking bins. Other people utilized continuous flow through systems. And all of these were really intriguing to me, but I was on a budget. And so that kind of helped me to make part of my choice. But I still wondered what the best route would be with regard to drainage. And that's where we get into the first reason why you don't need drainage holes. So I was listening to some material from a very well-known vermicomposter and vermiculturist, Rhonda Sherman. And I regard her as an expert in the field. And in one of her videos, she was doing an interview and was discussing leachate. And leachate is basically the liquid that runs out of the bottom of some bins. And in her words, you should not have any leachate coming out of the bottom of your bin. And so for me, that was very helpful. And I took that advice and I took those words of wisdom and I utilized them in determining what I would do. And that really was one of the turning points that helped me to decide on not having holes drilled in the bottom of my bins. So it was less work, but I was also, in case it didn't quite work out, I could repurpose the bin for something else, right? It wasn't in a place where the bin was no longer able to be used for many purposes. So I highly recommend that since a worm bin should not have leachate, that you don't drill holes. And that's going to bring us into some of the considerations that a person might want to have if they decide not to drill holes in the bottom of their worm bin for drainage. According to Rhonda Sherman, who again I regard as an expert in the field, you shouldn't have leachate or excess liquids just dripping out of the bottom of your bin, right? So in essence, your worm bin should have managed moisture. And so in that regard, one of the best ways to manage the moisture of your bin is going to be to manage the ratio of brown materials or carbonaceous materials versus green materials or nitrogenous materials. And the best way to do that is going to be to utilize a common ratio that people will say, which is adding 2 parts brown materials for every 1 part of green materials that you add to the bin. So anytime you're feeding your bin with green materials, whether that be food waste or coffee grounds, or brewery waste, or whatever that might be, you want to measure that out roughly by volume and put about twice the volume of your green material in brown material into the bin. So twice as much by volume of brown material as you do green material. And that's just going to help to keep the bin from being overly saturated. So that, I think, is a very important key with regard to managing moisture in your bin. But another key, and this is a rule of thumb that I've kind of utilized, I can't remember the source of this, but the person who mentioned it said that as long as you have shredded cardboard, which I'm getting away from using, but as long as you have brown materials in your bin, so those would be unprocessed brown materials in your bin, the worms will always have something to eat. And I think that's really important to keep in mind. Oftentimes when we think about food for worms, we think about green materials. But the reality is that worms are decomposers, and they're going to work on both the green and the brown materials, right? They're going to process both of those. And so the beautiful thing is that even though they do process the green materials at a faster rate, of course, they're going to have help from microbes within the bin, but the green materials are going to break down at a faster rate. But the brown materials end up being what some vermicomposters or vermiculturists will refer to as slow food. So the worms will eat it, but not at the same rate that they would a banana, right? Or a banana peel. Green materials. So that's really important to keep in mind, is that you can always add brown materials. And so if you're watering your bin and you feel like, oh, I think I overdid it, you can always add in some extra insurance brown material just to keep the moisture from being too much. And that's a really good way to kind of help you, especially early on in your journey of managing a worm bin. It's a really great rule of thumb just to help you manage the moisture so that you are not flooding the bin, your bin is not too wet. When the bin gets too wet, one of the unfortunate things that can happen is that the bin can actually go what's called anaerobic. Okay, so what that means is that if the bin gets too wet, you can have pockets where there is not the access to oxygen, and as a result, you're going to have anaerobic bacteria flourish, and those tend to be problematic. You're going to have a lot of smells in your bin, etc. So, with all of that said, going back to my original point, you don't need holes, drainage holes in your worm bin. That, again, I took from a specialist in the field, and I think that there are a lot of ways that you can manage that with the way that you feed and manage moisture within your bin. That being said, another neat point about not having drainage holes is that leachate does contain nutrients, right? So any liquids that are coming out of your worm bin are essentially nutrients just dripping out, right? Just coming right out. And so I like to think about trapping all of those nutrients, right? Containing them within your system. And so I think that's a really big benefit of not putting drainage holes in your worm bin, is that you are able to, as you manage the moisture, you are able to to keep those nutrients from just dripping out through the excess liquid that's leaving the bin. So that is a very big plus in my mind, and I feel like it helps me to feel like I'm getting the best product that I can from the work that the worms are doing with the organic materials that I'm providing them. So it's a win-win in my opinion. You don't have to do the work of drilling the holes, but you do kind of get a bit of a better hands-on feel for how to manage your bin, right? Specifically, how to manage that moisture, whether it's through feedings, through waterings, through adding brown materials. You get all of that experience, and I think that's really helpful, and I feel like it helps to make you a better worm farmer. So with that being said, those are some of the reasons why I highly advise that you check out trying a bin without drainage holes. So without further ado, in this channel we do try to get hands-on. So I'm actually going to take you into one of my bins so that you can actually see what it's like, right? We've talked about it, we've talked about the theory, but let's see what it actually is like when you have a bin without drainage holes. My concern before we get in there would be, what is the bottom like, right? If you're not having that drainage, does it get too moist? And so we'll get to see how I've been able to manage my bins so that we can see what the bottom is like and see if we are pooling too much water, right? If we're pooling too much liquid, and what we can do in situations where that might happen. All right, so this is one of our bins. At this point, I manage 4 bins, and that number is growing, but currently manage 4 bins. 3 of them house European night crawlers, and 1 of them houses red wigglers. And in this bin here, we fed some pumpkin. You can see it. You can see the decay happening, but remember, in this video, we are looking at the moisture, right? And this was an established bin that we kind of tossed more food on top of. So I'm going to go ahead and dig into the corner here so that we can see what the moisture is like in this bin. And as you see in the corners, this is really where I figure that theoretically you'd have more concern in a bin like this. Without the drainage holes, the concern would be that it would be too wet. And in the corners, they look all right. Now, they do need a little bit of fluffing. I think that's one thing that I would say, but I don't know that that would really be too much different whether you had holes for drainage or not. That's just going to happen over time with the compaction and gravity, obviously, and the weight of the items that you're adding atop the worm bin. But the moisture is just fine. In fact, it's kind of nice and moist down there. And we're able to get down there, and I'll actually pull out some of this material so you can actually see it. This is the material from the bottom of the worm bin, the bottom corner. And you can see that it's nice and crumbly. We've got a worm in, several worms in there actually, as you can see. And they seem to be doing just fine. So I will acknowledge that my journey in worm farming has hardly been a straight linear one. And so there have been times where I did not practice the best feeding practices, and had a bin. Actually, I think it was this bin actually, where I fed an entire watermelon, just whole, tossed it in there. And unlike a pumpkin, watermelons are floated with water, and unfortunately, that did actually release water into the bin, and there was standing water on the bottom. So the question that you might ask is, is having a bin like this still foolproof? And yes and no would be the answer to that. In that situation with the watermelon, when I noticed the standing water, what I did was I immediately brought large amounts of brown materials, poured them in, and then distributed them throughout the bin to absorb the excess moisture. And I think I even ended up splitting that bin to aid in the process. But I was able to overcome even my mistake in that regard with a bin that did not have drainage holes. So I really think that you can have a thriving worm population and a thriving worm bin without having drainage holes. And I think that it is beginner friendly enough, but I also think that it will provide you with great opportunities to be able to get a feel for how to gauge your bin's moisture and really how to manage it. So I really hope that you give that a shot, that if you are thinking about starting a new worm bin, that you would consider doing so without drainage holes and see how that goes. So thanks so much for watching. If you have other opinions or ideas, obviously this is my opinion. This is where I'm coming from, and I'd love to hear your idea. Maybe you started out with a stacking bin, and stacking bins and trays definitely have their benefits. But I'd really love for you to consider the benefits of not drilling those holes and of gaining that experience with regard to managing your bin's moisture and keeping more of those nutrients within your bin. I think it'll be a real blessing to you, and I think it'll be really neat for your worms. So without further ado, I'll bid you a good night.